What if the most dangerous moment in a celebrity's life isn't on stage, but behind a closed hospital door? Because that's where this story begins. Not with applause, not with flashing cameras, but with a silent hallway, white walls, a blinking monitor, and a woman the world thought was untouchable suddenly fighting for her life. For decades, she made millions laugh. She was the comforting presence on screen. The dependable one, the woman who survived Hollywood without scandal, without public collapse, without becoming a headline cautionary tale. Or so it seemed. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Until everything stopped. Late one night, emergency staff rushed a beloved actress into intensive care. The reason? Never fully explained. The timing? Unsettling. And the people around her? Strangely quiet. No press conference. No reassuring statement. No smiling family photo. Just silence. And silence, as you know, is where speculation grows teeth. Hours later, the unthinkable happened. The actress was gone. Officially, the details were private. A word Hollywood uses when the truth is either too complicated or too dangerous. Fans mourned. Tributes poured in. Co-stars shared memories. But behind the scenes, something else was unfolding. Something far more unsettling. Because within days, a voice broke through the silence. Not a studio executive. Not a publicist. Not a lifelong friend. Her eldest son. And what he said didn't bring comfort. It didn't bring closure. It brought questions. Dark ones. He didn't cry on camera. He didn't ask for privacy. He didn't thank fans. Instead, he spoke carefully, almost clinically, as if every word had been rehearsed not for sympathy, but for survival. Why would a grieving son measure his words like that? Why did his statement contradict what the family's representative had said just hours earlier? And why did he refuse to mention his father at all? That's when whispers began to circulate. About the marriage, about the hospital visit, about the hours before her collapse. People started connecting dots they were never meant to see. Friends remembered arguments that never made the tabloids. Crew members recalled tension on set that felt personal, not professional. And one former assistant, speaking anonymously, dropped a single sentence that sent chills through anyone who heard it. She was scared near the end. Scared of what? Or who? Hollywood loves a clean narrative, a graceful exit, a legacy preserved in soft lighting and kind words. But real lives are messier than press releases. And sometimes the people closest to you know exactly which truths must stay buried. The husband, a respected creative figure in his own right, vanished from public view after her death. No interviews, no memorial appearances, no statements beyond a brief, carefully worded line released through legal counsel. Meanwhile, the younger son stayed completely silent. No posts, no comments, no appearances, just the eldest son, standing alone in the storm, saying just enough to be heard, but not enough to be safe. And here's the part that no one wants to talk about. The hospital admission wasn't sudden. Records suggest she had been there before. Quietly, briefly, always away from cameras. So why did no one know? Why was the family so practiced at keeping this hidden? And why after her death did those carefully maintained walls begin to crack? This isn't a story about fame. It's a story about what fame hides. About marriages that look solid from the outside. About children who grow up watching adults perform, even at home. And about the moment when silence stops protecting people and starts implicating them. Because as investigators would later discover, the hours before her hospitalization weren't as calm as the public was led to believe. Not even close. The night everything began to unravel didn't start with sirens. It started with a phone call that was never supposed to be made. According to people close to the family, it came just after midnight. A call placed from inside the house, not to emergency services. Not at first, but to someone who knew how to make problems disappear. Think about that for a moment. If someone collapses unexpectedly, you call for help. Immediately. Instinctively. So why hesitate? Why reach for discretion before reaching for a doctor? That single delay would later become one of the most unsettling details investigators quietly flagged. Not publicly, not officially, but privately, among themselves, where theories are tested before they're spoken out loud. Inside the house, the atmosphere had been tense for weeks. That much is clear now. The actress had been withdrawing. Friends noticed canceled dinners, missed calls, long gaps between messages that used to arrive daily. When she did speak, she sounded tired, not physically, emotionally, as if something heavy had been pressing on her chest for a long time. She had confided in one person that marriage, after decades, can become a performance too. Always smiling, always reassuring, always pretending nothing is wrong. But something was wrong. That evening, an argument reportedly erupted behind closed doors. No screaming that neighbors could hear, no broken glass. Just the kind of argument that cuts deeper because it's quiet, controlled. The kind where every sentence is measured, sharpened, and meant to land exactly where it hurts most. Words about control, about money, about who owed whom loyalty. And then, silence. The husband later described it as a misunderstanding. A disagreement that resolved itself. But here's the contradiction that refuses to go away. If it resolved itself, why did staff find the bedroom door locked from the inside? If it resolved itself, why was she found unresponsive hours later? And if everything was fine, why were certain phone records deleted before authorities could request them? These are not accusations, they're questions. And questions are dangerous when no one wants to answer them. When paramedics finally arrived, they found a woman who looked peaceful. Too peaceful, some would later say. No signs of struggle, no obvious trauma, just a body that had stopped cooperating with life. The initial hospital admission was labeled precautionary, another word that sounds harmless until you realize how often it's used to buy time. Time to prepare statements, time to notify lawyers, time to decide which version of events the world will hear. Inside the hospital, tension followed her. The husband remained composed, almost unnervingly so. Nurses noted how calm he was, how focused on logistics instead of emotion. How, he asked about paperwork before prognosis. People grieve differently, sure, but even seasoned medical staff whispered about it later. Then came the sons. The younger one arrived first. Quiet, head down, refused to speak to anyone. The eldest arrived later. And that's when things shifted. Witnesses remember him standing in the hallway, staring at his father, not with grief, but with suspicion. No hug, no words exchanged. Just a look that lingered too long to be accidental. That look would resurface later in his public statement, not directly, but in the way he chose his words, in what he included, and more importantly, in what he left out. When doctors announced that the actress's condition was deteriorating rapidly, the room filled with people who loved her, or claimed to. But one person was missing. The husband had stepped out. He said it was to make a call. No one knows who he called. No one has admitted it. And the phone he used was never recovered. By the time he returned, it was too late. The official time of death was recorded, the cause deferred, and the machinery of Hollywood grief began moving at full speed. But behind the scenes, something else was happening. The eldest son requested access to her personal belongings. Her phone, her journal, items he said she would have wanted him to have. The request was denied. That denial would haunt him, because what he believed was on that phone was the truth. And as the days passed, his silence became heavier than any statement, until he finally spoke. And when he did, he didn't accuse, he implied. And that implication was enough to set everything on fire. By the time the eldest son decided to speak, he already knew he was crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. This wasn't an emotional outburst. It wasn't grief spilling over. It was calculated, deliberate, and born from something he had seen with his own eyes. Because after the funeral, after the cameras left, after the condolences dried up, he did something most families never think to do. He went back to the house, not to mourn, not to reminisce, but to look. The house was spotless, too spotless. As if grief had been vacuumed out along with any trace of the night that mattered. Furniture rearranged, trash bins emptied. Even the bedroom felt staged, like a set after the final scene has been wrapped. That alone raised his suspicion. People don't clean when they're devastated. They freeze. They forget. They leave things untouched because touching them hurts. But this place had been reset, erased. Then he found the first thing that didn't belong, a medication bottle tucked behind a drawer. Not hers, not prescribed to anyone in the household, at least not officially. The label had been partially peeled off, but the dosage was clear, too strong to be casual, too specific to be accidental. Why was it there? And why hadn't it been mentioned in any hospital report? As he kept searching, small inconsistencies began stacking up. A cracked phone screen in the guest room trash, a clock unplugged in the bedroom, frozen at a time that didn't match the official timeline. A faint smell of cleaning chemicals that lingered days after the death. Each detail alone meant nothing. Together, they felt like a message. Someone had been busy. That's when he did the unthinkable. He contacted someone his parents had spent decades avoiding. A former family lawyer. Not the one currently on retainer. An older one. Someone who had quietly stepped away years earlier after a professional disagreement with the husband. Someone who knew where the bodies were buried, figuratively at least. The lawyer didn't sound surprised. That's what terrified him most. Instead of shock, there was hesitation. Long pauses. Carefully chosen words, the kind people use when they know more than they're allowed to say. She was thinking about changing things, the lawyer finally admitted. Changing what? The son asked. Everything. According to him, there had been private meetings months earlier. Conversations about assets, control, exit strategies. The actress had been asking questions that made certain people very uncomfortable. Questions about what she owned. Questions about what she was entitled to. Questions about what would happen if she decided to leave. And then came the sentence that changed how the son saw everything. She told me she didn't feel safe having these conversations at home. Not unsafe in the way tabloids love to sensationalize. No bruises, no police calls. Just the quiet, corrosive kind of fear that builds when someone realizes the life they're living is no longer theirs. That fear suddenly explained the hospital visits. The secrecy, the exhaustion people mistook for age or workload. It reframed the arguments. The silence, even the way she'd hugged her sons the last time they saw her, holding on just a second longer than usual. Like someone saying goodbye without saying it. When the son finally broke his silence publicly, he chose his words with surgical precision. He didn't say murder. He didn't say guilt. He didn't say his father's name at all. Instead, he talked about timing, about unanswered questions, about things that didn't sit right. He spoke about love and fear existing in the same space, about how people can be kind in public and terrifying in private, about how silence can be used as a weapon. The reaction was immediate. Some praised his bravery, others accused him of exploiting tragedy, and a few, very quietly, reached out with stories of their own. Stories about the husband. About control, disguised as charm, about careers subtly redirected, about people pushed out when they became inconvenient. And then, just as the pressure began to mount, something happened that no one expected. The husband broke his silence, not with an interview, not with a denial, but with legal action. And that move would reveal more than any confession ever could, because once lawyers get involved, the truth has a way of leaking out whether anyone wants it to or not. The legal papers arrived before the sympathy cards stopped. That alone told the eldest son everything he needed to know. Grief usually buys time, even in Hollywood, even in ugly breakups. People wait. They let emotions cool. They avoid escalation because escalation invites scrutiny. But this wasn't waiting. This was preemptive. The lawsuit wasn't framed as an attack. That was the clever part. It was positioned as protection. Protection of privacy. Protection of false narratives. But read closely, and something else became obvious. The husband wasn't responding to what the son had said. He was responding to what the son hadn't said yet. Think about that. Why rush to shut someone down unless you're afraid of what they might reveal next? The filing accused the eldest son of reckless insinuations and emotional harm. It warned him against discussing medical details, family conversations, and anything that could be interpreted as speculation. In other words, it tried to put a legal fence around the truth before it had a chance to breathe. And buried deep in the language was a phrase that set off alarms for anyone paying attention. Events preceding hospitalization, not death. Not illness, preceding hospitalization. Why specify that? Why draw attention to the hours before she entered medical care unless those hours were vulnerable? The son noticed it immediately. So did the former lawyer. So did a journalist who had been quietly watching from the sidelines, waiting for the story to crack open. Because lawsuits don't just silence people, they leave paper trails. And paper trails can be followed. As the legal process unfolded, requests for documents began circulating. Phone logs, security footage, medical intake notes. Most were denied. Some were delayed, but a few slipped through the cracks, as they always do. One nurse's intake note stood out. It referenced elevated distress inconsistent with the husband's description of events. It also mentioned a hesitation when asked a simple question. Had there been any recent emotional trauma? The husband answered, no. But the patient's body language suggested otherwise. Another detail surfaced from a security contractor who had serviced the house years earlier. He recalled disabling an internal camera system temporarily the week before her hospitalization. A routine upgrade, he'd been told. Except the system was never fully restored. Why remove eyes from a house that prized privacy above all else? The son started to feel like he was piecing together a puzzle someone had tried very hard to scatter. Every time he pushed, resistance followed. Calls went unanswered. Old friends suddenly became distant. Even extended family advised him to stop. You're hurting yourself, they said. You're rewriting history. Let her rest. But how do you let someone rest when you suspect they never truly did? Behind closed doors, the husband's composure began to fracture. Associates noticed irritability, missed meetings, sudden changes in routine. A man who once thrived on control now seemed haunted by unpredictability. Because the thing about silence is this: once it's broken, it never goes back to being harmless. The media started asking sharper questions. Not accusations, just questions. Why were medical records sealed so quickly? Why did timelines shift between statements? Why had certain household staff been replaced within weeks? Each question chipped away at the carefully constructed narrative. And then came the moment that changed the balance of power entirely. The eldest son received a message from someone he had never met, a former assistant, briefly employed, quietly dismissed. The message was short. I was there that night. I didn't understand it then. I do now. Attached was a time-stamped photo, grainy, poorly lit, taken unintentionally according to the sender. A reflection in a window, a figure standing in a hallway at a time that contradicted everything the husband had sworn to. It wasn't